I think it's fair to say that in most people's views, church history is not one of the more sexy of subjects. But it's to the great achievement of Professor Diarmaid MacCulloch that he has turned church history into a BBC rating success. And over a whole series of magnificent television programs has brought church history to masses. He's an incredible communicator, but he's also a I'll start again. I think it's fair to say that in most people's view, church history is not one of the more sexy of subjects, but it's the great achievement of Professor Diarmaid MacCulloch that he has turned theology and church history into a TV rating success. He's a spectacular communicator, now very well known on British television, for bringing subjects such as the Reformation, Thomas Wolsey and other such subjects to a wide audience. But he is first and foremost a great scholar of church history, particularly the world of Reformation Europe and the wars of religion which this generated, which he's going to talk about today. And in a series of remarkable books, of which probably the most famous is The Reformation, which won the Wolfson Prize, the premier history prize for fine writing in history. He has revitalized, I think, the entire field. And we've been trying to get him here for a while, so we're very proud, finally, to hand over to Professor MacCulloch. Thank you.
Thank you, William, for that generous introduction. This is the British Academy lecture, and I don't suppose many of you know what the British Academy is. So just a quick word about that. There are two societies of scholars in the United Kingdom. One is the Royal Society, which is more than 300 years old, and the business of the Royal Society is science, technology, engineering, medicine. In other words, they're interested in how to do things and to actually make things and that sort of thing. The British Academy is the rest of human wisdom. And it's the wise bit, because it tells you why you should do things and the reasons you do. It deals with human beings. It's the humanities and social sciences. So it's things like philosophy, psychology, social sciences, and of course, history. All these things are subjects which stop societies going insane. You need wisdom to stop going insane. And the Reformation is one of those subjects on which people are very liable to go insane. And I want to explore with you the real Reformation of the 16th century so that we may all be a bit saner by the end of this hour. Now, you perhaps noticed the title of the book that William was talking about. It's Reformation, Europe's House Divided. I wanted it to be called just House Divided, but then my publisher, who had much more commercial sense than me, said, well, no one will know what it's about. We've got to have Reformation in the title. So I gave way, but I kept that phrase, House Divided, because it's so important to understand the Reformation as a great tearing apart of a fabric. It's like a car accident. All around you, debris are littered around by the end of the 16th century. And you may think that's a good thing. You may think that this is a revolution which was necessary and splendid and exciting. You may think it's a catastrophe, like a car accident. But I want to suggest to you that this dividing of Europe in the 16th century was actually a return to normality. What was it dividing? It was dividing the Western Latin Church, one part of Christianity. A church which had dominated Europe for 1,000 years. And what was so remarkable about that church was its oneness. It had one liturgical language and language for thinking in and talking in, Latin. It had one great bishop as its head, the Bishop of Rome, who had a title, the Pope. In all sorts of ways, this was one world, and it ceased to be one world in the 16th century. Now, that is not a catastrophe. It's a return to the normality of human experience. I challenge any of you to think of any society which has been dominated by one religion for so long, for 1,000 years. I think Saudi Arabia has managed it for perhaps a century. But no other society in human history, I'm prepared to take questions afterwards to prove I'm wrong, has had this possibility. So you see, that's why the Reformation is the restoration of a normal human experience, of diversity in religion. It's not a freak. It was the previous society which was a freak. Now, this catastrophe has dominated the thinking of Europeans, and hence, thanks to 19th century expansion, the rest of the world. If you think of Christianity, you probably think these days of Catholics or Protestants, and they are both heirs of the Reformation. Both of them really are relating to that. Catholics talk about the counter-Reformation. Protestants just talk and celebrate the Reformation. Myths get clustered round such a big idea. All sorts of myths. Like, for instance, the great complacent Protestant myth that the whole church in the West was just looking for the Reformation to happen, and all you needed to do if you were Martin Luther was give it a little push, and it would fall over and fall apart. Now, that is simply a myth, a Protestant myth. And if you just bore down on any bit of the late medieval church, and you see how wrong it is. I mean, I live in England, and England was an extraordinarily well-regulated part of this old church. Its bishops were conscientious, scholarly, efficient administrators, perhaps a bit dull, but that's what they needed for their church, because it was just going along nice and smoothly. If you were to move from England across the water into Ireland, you'd find the same Western Latin church, but very different state, rather chaotic, no great organization, but full of life and fervor. The proof of that is if you travel, particularly in Western Ireland, those great expanses of green, you'll see on the landscape ruins of a particular sort of church, the Church of Friars, Franciscan friars, now all roofless, thanks to the English, but all datable to the 15th and early 16th century. What are we looking at there? We're looking at the proof of a religious revolution. The Franciscan friars had come along and they had revived this church before the Protestant Reformation happened. So there was a lively church. Perhaps in terms of institutions, a bit chaotic, but it worked. And you could go around Europe finding these particular situations. The fact was that when Martin Luther made his protest, most Europeans were happy with the church they had. It satisfied consumer demand overwhelmingly. And that makes the Reformation far more interesting. How could such a movement destroy such a powerful, popular, successful institution? How could it happen? Well, when I was a lad, or at least an undergraduate at university, I was told that the reasons were mainly social and economic. There were things like nationalism, which, to tell you the truth, hardly existed in the 16th century. And all those explanations, it seems to me, were wrong. Because the only thing which would destroy such a successful institution was an idea. The power of ideas lay behind this institution's fall. And that's what I want to talk to you, explore with you next. What was the big idea which could do this to such an organization? Death. The power of death. What happens to us all after death? The one question which faces us all in the end. That is what destroyed the church as it was and rebuilt it in other forms. Why? Because the Christian New Testament, second half of the Christian scriptures, has some very specific ideas about how you get through the barrier of death and what happens to you then. There's a stark choice, heaven or hell. But who is going to make the choice? Is it you facing death, or is it your God? Well, in the very earliest Christian writings, which are the authentic letters of Paul, there are some inauthentic letters of Paul in the New Testament, but the real ones, particularly the epistle to the Romans and Galatians, the letters to the Romans and Galatians, there is a very definite picture of who is in charge of death. It is God. You are helpless in the hands of God, and God does not need to listen to anything you do or say in order to decide your fate between heaven and hell. And the reason for that is that our ancestors, Adam and Eve, committed such a sin in the Garden of Eden through their disobedience to God that they were worthless. There was nothing in them which was worth saving. So if God saved anybody to go through to his presence in heaven, then that's his decision and a merciful act of grace. Nothing you do, giving money to a beggar, is not going to help you get to heaven. God will make that decision. We are worthless. That's Paul's idea, way back 2,000 years ago. About 400 years after him, another great thinker of the Western Latin Church put it really rather frighteningly, that you and I are lumps of lostness, lumps of perdition, and all we can do is lay helpless back in the hands of God. Now that then is the picture which you get out of the Bible, or at least the New Testament, or at least the letters of Paul. And it's the picture on which this great Western Latin-speaking theologian Augustine brooded in North Africa during the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine trained his extraordinary mind on this central idea of Paul's, like a magnifying glass training the rays of the sun onto a problem. And it smoldered into life, into fire. What do you do with such an idea? Well, all you do is lay back on the mercy of God. But actually, it's pretty frightening, isn't it, this picture? This binary picture, either heaven or hell, decision in the hands of God. And actually, the church sort of stepped back from it. I think clergy felt sorry for their people and said, well, perhaps it's not quite that stark. And what there may be is another chance for you and me. After our short lives, our 70 years, our 70 years, there may be thousands of years in which we can go on trying. We can go on being purged from our state of lostness, from our sin, and then enter the presence of God because we have done our time, so to speak. Not even so to speak, we have done our time. And this time is tens of thousands of years, perhaps millions, in a state of purging, purgatory. The church stumbled over a way of getting round heaven and hell, purgatory. And purgatory is not a nice place. It is like hell. It is full of fire and pain. But the one difference is that it has an end, an exit door, and only one exit door to heaven. You're not going to go to hell if you've been in purgatory. So actually, the doctrine of purgatory is a comforting doctrine, an optimistic doctrine. It gives you and me hope for the future. Purgatory was one of the biggest success stories of all Christian thinking. It satisfied people from about the 4th, 5th centuries through to the 16th. And then it stumbled over Martin Luther. This German friar, a scholar, a university lecturer, that's his only authority in the church, a university lecturer with a doctorate, a DD. And what he did was to read Augustine. And he could do this as his generation could for the first time in a new way, in great printed scholarly editions of the works of Augustine. They'd been in manuscript before, but now laid in front of you in any library. There they all were. And if you read Augustine thinking about Paul, you saw a very different picture from that purgatory picture. The thing about purgatory, if you and I can do things in the next life, it's possible we could use all that power of doing things in the next life to help our friends and relations in this life. So souls in purgatory could pray to help people who are related to them, who they loved, who they cared for in this life. And also, we could pray for each other to get through purgatory quickly. The late medieval church had built on that idea, particularly because the most powerful form of prayer you can get is the Mass, the bread and wine which become the body and blood of Christ. How could you have a more powerful form of prayer than that? So the late medieval church had created masses dedicated for the prayer of the dead. They created institutions called chantries, and people spent fortunes on these things. I wonder how many of you have been to Westminster Abbey in London. Well, I see lots of hands going up there. Well, if you look at the east end of that, the very intricate, magnificent bit near the Houses of Parliament is one of the biggest chantry chapels ever built for the troubled soul of King Henry VII. That's what a chantry chapel could be like. This was a huge industry, a factory of prayer. Now, Martin Luther, reading Augustine, saw that it was all nonsense. It did not work. It should not work. It did not correspond to the theology, the thinking of Paul or Augustine. And Martin Luther said so. And the trouble about academics, we tend to be very keen on saying things, and particularly if we think they're true. And he was astonished when church leaders told him to shut up. They told him to be obedient to the church. And so they began arguing past each other. Martin Luther was talking about grace and salvation. The church authorities were talking about obedience, keeping quiet, saying what the Pope wants to hear. That's what the clash was about. Why did so many people listen? Because it is a very powerful message, and it's liable to make you angry, because you and your friends have been cheated by your spiritual leaders. You have been made, persuaded, fooled into giving the church vast sums of money to build structures like Henry VII's Chantry Chapel at Westminster Abbey. You will be angry. And actually, if you are a clergyman, a priest who has been part of this system, you will also likely be ashamed. You will feel that you have been part of the cheat. And that is why I think so many leaders of the 16th century Reformation were clergy of the old church. They were ashamed, and they were determined now to tell other people of the real truth. And they were, in the end, called Protestants. It's a funny technical word, Protestant. It comes from a particular political crisis in Germany, when a number of the supporters among the princes in Germany, the supporters of Luther, protested against being told to shut up by the Holy Roman Emperor. That's where the word Protestant comes from. It gradually developed to describe anyone who followed this movement. So it's an angry movement. It's a movement full of the feeling you've been cheated. And that will lead you to violence. If you feel that you have either been cheated or helped to cheat, you will want to say something and then do something. One thing you will do is destroy symbols of the old church. So all over Europe, particularly Northern Europe, people started smashing churches up. They marched in, they threw stones through the windows, they had bonfires of the mass books, tore down statues. iconoclasm became one of the great features. One of the things I think that you and I find so difficult to understand about the Reformation, that should be so mindlessly violent. Of course, the other thing it destroyed were people, because the old church, in its frenzied desire to stop this movement destroying people's souls as they saw it, burned people at the stake for being heretics. And Protestants killed people too. They committed atrocities against monks and killed them, and priests, as churches burned. It was a movement then full of violence on all sides. And in the past, both sides have remembered their own violence. So in England, we have a great Protestant book called Fox's Book of Martyrs. John Fox wrote this book in the 16th century. It became a wildly popular book among Protestants, and Queen Elizabeth's government actually ordered copies to be put in all the great churches of the land, alongside the Old Testament and the New Testament. It became almost a third scripture. But then Catholics had their stories too, stories of their martyrs being arrested, tortured, and hanged, drawn, and quartered, that appalling set of English punishments for treason. Both sides nursed their grievances. And England, I think, remained up to my boyhood in the 1950s, a Protestant country. It might no longer have read Fox's Book of Martyrs, but it remembered in folk memory that Catholics were different. They were alien. Often they were Irish, which was a double dose of being different. And it was only now that that has ceased to be. There's another thing about these cherished myths of victimhood and violence and destruction. We tend conveniently to separate them from the sort of violence and destruction which we see in the modern world. Over the last few years, ISIS have done precisely the same things as Protestants and Catholics did to each other in the 16th century. They smash up beautiful things, as Protestants did. They burn people alive, as Catholics and some Protestants did. And one of the lessons of history is never to get too furious about something which is happening in the present when it has happened in your own past. Christians, in other words, did precisely what ISIS have done, and pray God do not go on doing much longer. That's not to understand or excuse or condone ISIS. It is to remind us that this is not a characteristic of Islam or Christianity. It's a characteristic of human stupidity and wickedness and understandable emotions, such as fear, anger, the sense of being cheated. And that may help us to understand the present day just as much as it helps to understand the past. Another thing which it's important to build in to history is complication. Historians like me are designed to complicate your view of the past, because it will stop you and me making stupid statements about the past based on simple stories. I mean, for instance, it sounds absolutely straightforward, doesn't it? The Reformation's about Catholics and Protestants. Well, yes, but Protestants never united. Within about 5 years of that initial rebellion by Martin Luther in 1517, they had divided on really, really important things. They couldn't agree, for instance, on what happened in that service of bread and wine. Yes, the Mass had been discredited in its old form, but what did bread and wine become? Were they the body and blood of Christ? Luther thought so, just like the Pope, but other Protestants didn't, and that became a great cause of division. Luther, on the matter of smashing images, soon thought it was a very bad thing, and he stopped his followers smashing images. Other Protestants went on thinking this is a very good thing to do, and these two groups got names. So Luther's followers, guess what, became Lutherans, What are we going to call the other Protestants, however? We can't call them just non-Lutherans. It's not a very good name for a church. You can't see it on a church notice board, can you? So they thought about this, and they thought of a wonderful piece of one-upmanship. They would be Reformed Protestants. Not just Reformed from Rome, but Reformed from the half-papist Lutherans. And that's the division which has remained in Protestantism ever since. There are Reformed Protestants and Lutheran Protestants. There's also a funny thing called Anglicanism, which is really, I'll let you into the secret, a form of Reformed Protestantism gone to the bad. Now these are complications in the story, complications. We need to keep our eyes always on complications. We also need to see how present situations come out of the past. We already talked about ISIS and destruction and iconoclasm. One very powerful idea in the 16th century was the idea of the last days coming, when Christ would come back to earth and sort everything out. It's a fatally seductive idea because it is there in the Bible. And in the 16th century, it became rather plausible. It wasn't just that there had been this great division in the church, but terrible political things were happening. The Ottoman Turks were pushing ever westward. They captured Buda and occupied it from 1530. They had already killed the king of Hungary in the great battle of Mohacs in 1526. It looked as if they would take over Europe. The frontiers of God's kingdom were being pushed back by alien forces all the time. Surely this was part of God's purpose. It went along with the fact that the Pope was being challenged. So talk of the last days was everywhere in 16th century Protestantism and Catholicism. And when Protestants left across the Atlantic to go and found colonies in the North Atlantic, they went with that mood, that the last days were going to happen, and they were part of that story. And their descendants in the United States have hung on to that idea when most of European Christians have left it behind. And we've seen this come into present-day politics. It became hugely important in 19th century American politics, and that sort of evangelical last days mentality is still there in the minds of at least the advisors of the president, whom I will not name. The last days, and what effects does it have on you believing in the last days? One effect is that you don't listen to people who warn you about environmental change. Why should you bother? The last days are about to happen. And it is in fact almost blasphemous to worry about environmental change when Christ is going to come in glory any day. The other big political effect of the last days on American politics is to have an obsessive interest in the state of Israel. And the reason for this is that in the Bible, again, you need to fit various texts together to achieve this, but the last days will not happen until the Jews are converted to Christianity. And the trouble about the Jews is they've inconveniently scattered across the world. But from the 1940s, there was a state of Israel. And only gradually, actually during the 1960s, did conservative evangelical Americans wake up to the significance of that. And from the late 1960s, they started supporting the state of Israel, which so far has shown no signs of converting to Christianity, but remains the obsessive focus of their interests. And they will defend it through thick and thin, even against Palestinian Christians, who they still don't seem to notice at all. That is one of the effects of the last days, coming straight out of the Reformation, red in tooth and claw, and there in politics at the present day. And that's one of the reasons I think why modern Europeans don't understand the United States. Because we have forgotten all that, and yet it is still there in the minds of American Protestants. Well, and so far it's all been very depressing, hasn't it? Death, destruction, etc., etc. Let me tell you some good things about the Reformation. One was the fact that it did not create a replacement monolithic church, like its Western Latin predecessor. In fact, it created all sorts of churches, and some of them tried to persecute each other. But in the eastern part of Europe, some princes decided that this was foolish, particularly the Prince of Transylvania, then part of the former Kingdom of Hungary. Now, of course, it's in Romania. Wonderful place. I recommend you to go and visit Transylvania. It's a landscape of mountains and forests and beautiful towns. It's a bit like Switzerland with chaos. The then prince was rather radical in his thoughts and doubted actually some Christian doctrines. He didn't think the Trinity, for instance, could be found in the Bible, the idea of three in one as being God. And his kingdom was divided, or his principality was divided. It had Catholics, it had Lutherans, it had Reformed Protestants, and some other people like himself, who are increasingly called Unitarians by polite people, heretics by others. And so the prince got his nobility together in their assembly, the Diet, which moved around various towns in Transylvania. That year, in 1567, it moved to the town of Torda, which should be a great international tourist destination. Because the Diet of Torda sat down and created a declaration that no one in Transylvania should be persecuted for their religion. And if someone wishes to believe something, good. And if they don't like it in their community, just move to another. And moreover, what's more to the point, every parish in Transylvania, every community, every town, every village should be given a choice. They've got these choices in front of them. The Pope's religion, Lutheranism, the Reformed, and even the Unitarians. And they could now take a vote, and from that moment on, that community would be Lutheran or a Roman Catholic. And all you needed to do was walk to the next village if you didn't like it. That's all. And no one would be persecuted. And that actually remains the truth of Transylvania today. That's another reason for going to see it. That it's an extraordinary, exhilarating landscape. You drive from village to village, church to church, and you suddenly find it's even Unitarian, a medieval Gothic parish church, which is Unitarian. I have sat in the gallery of one of these churches, watching a Unitarian Sunday school, when in the rest of Europe in the 16th century, those poor little children would have been burnt at the stake for being heretics. The Declaration of Torah, so forgotten in European history, but so important to the future of Europe. This was the first time that any European polity, society, had said, okay, it's okay to be different. We'll just get on with each other. We won't kill. I think it's tragic that Transylvania is now remembered only in someone who never existed, Count Dracula, and not for this benevolent thing. And it is actually to Eastern Europe in the 16th century, not the West, that you look for toleration. I tell you, one of the most intolerant places in Europe in the 16th century, England. The English pride themselves on their toleration, but in fact they burned and killed many more people for religion than any other country in Europe, perhaps apart from Spain. But hey, it's to Transylvania, to Poland, which had the same decision. They even had Jews and Muslims in their boundaries, and they allowed them to stay within their communities. Poland has the proud boast, which is nearly true, that it was a state without stakes. It never burned anyone. Well, it burned very few people. So toleration is one of the great lessons of the Reformation. And you can see that, in a sense, this comes out of failure, because Protestants really wanted to boss people around just as much as Catholics. It's just that they couldn't. And then the Reformation had consequences. It had one dire consequence. In the 17th century, the tensions in Europe had grown so great that great armies clashed in 30 years of war, the 30 Years' War of Central Europe, one of the most awful episodes of civil war in human history. And although it had complications, it was about religion. And at the end of it, things were not much different from the beginning. What had happened was exhaustion. Catholics and Protestants agreed to just get on within carefully defined boundaries. And now Europe was divided in a much more benevolent way. All right, there were monolithic places. Scandinavia was now Lutheran. Spain and Portugal were now Catholic. But Europe had a system, grudgingly, which was of division, of difference. And for many thoughtful people, this began to be a virtue, to think that you could have different ideas side by side, and you could compare them. Not only that, but Europeans were now, for lots of other complicated reasons, leaving their own continent, not just going across the Atlantic, but encountering the great cultures of the East. The cultures of India, the cultures of China, Japan. And to their surprise, very often, they found that they respected them, that there was wisdom to be found in these other religions. Many of them became fascinated by the differences. And it is this set of ideas, attitudes, which collectively formed what we call the Enlightenment. You cannot separate the Enlightenment from the Reformation. Martin Luther is said to have said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." I don't think he did, actually, but he should have done. Because that's the essence of Protestantism. Here I stand, I can do no other. But what if someone else says the same thing over there and they mean a different thing? The Enlightenment is a way of coping with that. The Enlightenment is often seen as an anti-clerical, anti-religious movement. It was not. For a few French people, Voltaire, Diderot, yes, but most Enlightenment thinkers were not. They were troubled religious people trying to find a new way of expressing their religion. Jews, Christians in particular, ultimately Muslims, Hindus, had the same spirit. And in that spirit is a sense of comparison. The unique thing about the Western Enlightenment, its gift to the whole world, is the sense that I can stand outside myself and judge myself as I judge you, and assess you as I judge myself, assess myself. That's what the Enlightenment gives you. It puts your ideas into context. That is a gift from the Enlightenment. And it means that such a movement will reassess itself in the sense of looking at its scripture. Remember that all this has been based on a set of ideas in the Bible, which is not a single book, it's actually a library of books. If you say its name in Greek, you will see that, because it's biblia, which is a plural word meaning books. And what do these books say? Well, they say all sorts of things. And there may be messages underneath the main message which you need to listen to rather more than the main one. Take, for instance, something which I think all of us agree on in this hall. I won't put it to the test, but I think so. Slavery. Slavery is a bad thing, isn't it? Hands up, anyone who thinks that slavery is a good thing? No? Right. Well, up to the 17th century, the hands would all have gone up in a Christian community, and in most other communities too. Because slavery, although you might not like it, particularly for yourself, was part of the way the world was. And it had been put there by God. And the reason you know that is because the Bible says so. The Bible doesn't condone slavery, it takes it for granted. And all Christian societies did the same, up to the 17th century. And then they started having doubts. And the people who had doubts in the first place were a particular sort of Christian, a very radical sort of Christian, coming from England. They're called Quakers, the Society of Friends. Now, the Quakers have a particular view of how God gets in touch with you. And it is not primarily through the Bible. God comes from within you and tells you wisdom. The Bible's just a sort of extra help, if that. Now, with that attitude, Quakers, who were forming new societies all of themselves, could ignore the Bible. And they said, just out of their experience, slavery's bad. Slavery's bad, and we're going to get rid of it. They did so, for instance, in a colony of the 13 colonies in America called Pennsylvania, founded by themselves, by a man called William Penn, Quaker. And Pennsylvania means Penn's paradise. And in this paradise, there would be no slavery. Christians were very slow to catch on to that message. And in the 19th century, for instance, the United States fought a war between Protestant Christians about that issue. Let's not get complicated too much on this. It was about whether slavery should be permitted or not. And Southern slave owners were perfectly entitled to be baffled and angry with Northern abolitionists for denying the existence of slavery and saying it's bad, because the Bible they heard from their southern pulpits told them slavery was okay. So there's something which Enlightenment Christianity has done in the person of the Quakers to start with. Then, curiously, some Protestant evangelicals caught on too. William Wilberforce is a great name in this process, but it's really odd that a Protestant evangelical should deny the message of the Bible like that. You can only do it if you probe under the message in some of these books. That, then, is, I think, a good result of the Reformation. It's a few stages down the line before we all think slavery is bad, but in some ways, out of the argument of the Reformation, this has happened. And I think the Reformation can also teach some lessons to modern societies. Islam, for instance, is now struggling with the problem of not dominating certain societies, as it always assumed it would, and also wishing to make sure it does dominate the ones it's still got. That's one of the big problems in Islam. Now, Christianity had that problem up to the 18th century. It automatically assumed that it would dominate the societies which it consisted of, and would also do that elsewhere when it moved to them. And the Enlightenment stopped that. And in the 19th century, particularly Western Protestant Christianity went through agonies thinking that process through, thinking how not to be the dominant ideology in a culture, and also thinking how to use this Bible, which was causing so much problem now with slavery, for instance. So I think that's something which Islamic scholars might study for their own benefit. There are also other Christians who could benefit from looking at the Protestant Reformation. I think of orthodoxy. The Orthodox churches of the Eastern world, the churches which were Eastern, Latin, non-Latin, they were Greek-speaking, Russian-speaking, whatever. Now, they didn't have a Reformation. One good reason for that was that their New Testament was in Greek. And Greek Orthodox people, you may not be surprised to learn, speak Greek. So there was no shock for them in the shock of the Latin Church of the West, which had only heard the Bible in Latin for centuries. And suddenly in the 16th century, thanks to scholarship, they realized that the New Testament had actually been written in Greek. I think without Martin Luther, that would have blown the church apart, finding that its authority book had been written in another language. Well, the Orthodox didn't have that, so no challenge to their system of authority. And also then history victimized the Orthodox churches, perhaps that's the wrong word, dealt them some very bad cards. It dealt them, for instance, the Ottoman Empire, in which orthodoxy was a second tier within society, when Orthodox were constantly struggling to keep themselves in the equation. So the Ottoman Empire was one fact, which stopped them being experimental in their Christianity. Orthodox people now treasure the fact that their orthodoxy has always been the same. This is another myth. Up to the 14th century, orthodoxy was the bit of Christianity which was innovative, changing. But then the Ottomans came along, and it wasn't safe to do it any longer. You needed to survive. And in the 20th century, another example of these misfortunes for the Orthodox. Russia, 1917, another resonant anniversary. The Orthodox Church for a moment seemed to be free of the Tsars and to be able to look at its future with an openness. They had the first democratic, so to speak, elections to this synod of the Orthodox Church. And then immediately, the clamping down of the Bolsheviks. And there, even more, was the need to survive. And the way to survive is simply to hang on to what you've got and not change a thing. And then 1989, the Orthodox Church in Russia got power back. And particularly under President Putin, it has been being given power and wealth. All this shall be yours, says the Satan to Christ in the New Testament. And Christ rejected the idea. The Orthodox Patriarch has grabbed this power, grabbed this wealth. The Reformation might have things to say, therefore, to the Orthodox world of Christianity. I'm going to leave it at that, and perhaps William wants to open things up a bit. But what I leave you with is the idea that you can't ignore the Reformation. It is not a dead academic historical subject. It is there still to disturb or establish your sanity. Thank you.
I think when you spend a lifetime studying a subject, it can be very easy, as happens with so many academics, I think, to disappear down a burrow and be unable to distinguish the big picture. You specialize further and further down over many years. To have the ability, as Diarmaid has just done, to stand above it and to look down from a great height, to be able to see the wider patterns and how they ripple well beyond the shores of Europe, is an extraordinary achievement. So I think we did a big round of applause for Professor MacCulloch. I'll ask just one question before handing it over to the audience. But how much do you think in your lifetime, or even in the last 20 or 30 years, has the Reformation, the view of the Reformation, changed with the writings of people like Eamon Duffy, who've taken a far more critical approach to the Reformation? His wonderful book, Bare Ruined Choirs, was a revelation to me, and I'd always been taught to see the Reformation as something basically positive and intellectual.
Yeah.
And he was emphasizing very much that Taliban-like nature of so much that happened.
Well, yeah, two things have happened, I think, William. One is exactly what Eamon Duffy has done, which has reminded us of the importance of worship. Actually, religion is about worship. And if you don't understand what worship is about and see how it changes, then you won't understand religion. And so Eamon's wonderful book is a wonderful picture of the worship of the pre-Reformation Western Church. Where the book is weak is the second half, where the mood is of deploring what happened. Well, okay, you can think that. I've got my views on the Reformation. I'm perfectly happy to tell you what they are. They're sort of liberal Protestant, I guess. But that's not good history. And the trouble about Eamon, let me say this amid these four walls, I'm sure no one else is listening, is that he is a Catholic historian. Now, there are historians who are Catholics, who are great mates of mine, and Eamon is too, but they're historians who are Catholics. You wouldn't open their book and say, God, there's a Catholic historian there. Well, you would with Eamon. So that's one big thing, and he gave us that gift of understanding worship. The other thing is ideas, and I've talked about that. We just weren't interested in ideas 30, 40 years ago. We thought it was all about structures and economy and nationalism. And nationalism is really a 19th century invention. But the only people who really nationalist before that are the Aragonese and the English. And even then, it's really about dynasties, families. It's not about nations, because they didn't exist.
Do you think there's been an erosion of the Reformation in the last 20, 30 years, in the sense of going around, when you go around an English cathedral today, there are often images, there are candles, and many of the things that the original reformers fought against seem to have sort of crept back into English Protestantism?
You're right, particularly about that curious animal Anglicanism, which, for reasons which we can't go into in 8 minutes, became a slightly hybrid form of Catholic and Protestant.
One smells incense when one walks into cathedrals these days.
Yeah, hurrah! I like incense. Yes, that's certainly true. That in many ways, the divisions have been healed, but other divisions have taken their place. So now we don't argue about the nature of the Mass. Why should we? Because we're not Aristotelian philosophers anymore, and they were in the 16th century. So all those arguments, they were burning people for Aristotelian philosophy, really. So we don't do that. But you see that Christianity is now bitterly divided about another issue which wouldn't have been an issue in the 16th century, sex. And that puts conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants on the same side, and liberal Protestants and liberal Catholics on the issue of sexuality and gender.
Why would sexuality not have been an issue in the 16th century?
Because both sides shared broadly the same view of sex and gender. The one huge difference, huge, and I have to say this is huge, was the view of marriage. Now, before the Reformation, the Western Church was unique in having a completely unmarried clergy officially. I mean, you couldn't get married as a priest of the Western Latin Church. That's unique in Christian history, by the way.
Which was a late development, 12th century.
Yeah, exactly. 11th century, 12th century, it's very late. No other church has ever done it, thank God. And one of the reasons...
And in the Coptic Church, you can't become a priest if you're not married.
Yeah. It's almost as big an issue in the Reformation, it seems to me, as all the stuff I've talked to you about, grace and justification by faith and so on, whether clergy can get married. But what that does is raise marriage's profile. Previously, celibacy is the norm, the state to which you aspire as a Christian. Marriage is really down there at second rate. But once you've got clergy who are married, suddenly it becomes the real aspiration of everybody, and marriage is wonderful. So that's a big change in the Reformation. But that doesn't affect gender roles and sex in the way that the developments of the late 20th century have.
Let's open it up to you guys. Any questions? There's a hand here. And secondly, Roddy, gentleman in the cream jacket on the left here.
Could I ask a slightly obscure question? I'm a descendant of a Moravian bishop who are descended from Hussites. How actually do they fit into the Reformed Protestant world?
Oh, there's a big question, but I can answer it, of course, in 5 minutes. 2 minutes. The Moravians, very interesting bunch. You're right that behind them was a medieval dissenting group which had been marginalized and persecuted in Central Europe. The Reformation came along, they thought, hurrah, our time has come, but they were still being marginalized by Catholics. Then, in the 18th century, an eccentric Lutheran nobleman fell out with the Lutheran Church. It wasn't enthusiastic enough. And he noticed all over Europe that the great mainstream churches of the Reformation were not delivering the goods in terms of really convicting in the heart people. So he gathered all sorts of dissatisfied Protestants and maybe a few Catholics round him on his estates in Saxony. But then he thought, well, what am I going to call this lot? They've no identity. They're Lutherans, they're Reformed, they're Catholics. But he found 1 or 2 Hussites, these old Moravian brethren. So he invited them in. He said, I'll do your deal. I'll make your life lovely. And you have orders, clerical orders. And if you make me your bishop, I will create a Moravian church. So you see, it's a fictional identity created for a new body. And it had a new idea, which is to be missionaries to the world, Previously, that's the job of friars and clergy. Now, for every Moravian, it is a duty to make the whole world Christian. That's why they spread. They spread to India. They spread to the West Indies. They were the first big movement which said that lay people can do exactly what clergy do. Admirable group, and interestingly, not a group which has sought to grow much. I think that's a rather admirable quality in a religion, that it doesn't officiously bother other people.
Front row here, and then the gentleman who's got his hand up with the rolled program. And thirdly, this lady here.
You mentioned about the 30 Years' War. Would you call it more political than religious? Because Pope supported France. France supported Adolphus against the Catholic Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, you've done a very respectable thing, which is to complicate the 30 Years' War story. In the 30 Years' War, it is basically a story between Protestant and Catholics, but there were wheels within wheels, because the French would support a Protestant power in certain circumstances. The same was true in the 16th century, where the Catholic French king would support Protestants against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. Power politics were there, but it's not exactly nationalism, because what these two great rulers would think of themselves would be as the head of the Valois dynasty, or the head of the Habsburg family. And that's another thought in their minds beyond their religious identity. Always in this period, family is hugely important. There was a question. Oh, yeah.
And then this lady here.
How much was Renaissance and the resultant scientific inquiry responsible for the demise of the church? Is it not true that the masses started developing a scientific temperament and started questioning the very idea of religion and the church?
So is the question about how the Renaissance relates to the Reformation?
The scientific temperament resulted in the demise of the institution of the church. You said the idea of death was the main reason.
Now the Renaissance, I could have talked about the Renaissance, because there's a parallel movement of the intellect about something else entirely, which is to realize that there is more to life than the Middle Ages. And the more to life than the Middle Ages is ancient Greece and Rome. And that they can teach you wisdom, which you don't have, but you can get it out of their literature. Now that is actually quite a subversive thought as the Protestant Reformation is going on, because a Protestant should only look to the Bible, but so many of them were scholars and intellectuals that they were fascinated by the Renaissance. And you get the most interesting amalgams of that very pessimistic theology I've described to you, that we're all lumps of lostness, with the excitement and optimism of the Renaissance, that we are also creative and culture. And Reformed Christians are the ones who really make this most interesting. They turn it into an ideology of change and reform. And social change, which is one of the, I think, the most admirable things about Reformed Christianity.
Finally, over here.
I would like to ask about, slavery. You said was, considered okay.
About?
Sorry. Is that better? Yeah. The Bible said that slavery was okay, but. Wasn't it that it was only black people who were the slaves? So it sort of intersected with the construction of race, which came about with the the rise of science being the explanation for things beyond religion and taking over bit by bit. At least it was the case in Germany, that science was considered something, the rationality more than anything else. So could you say that, set that in perspective?
You're absolutely right about the connection between a certain sort of Enlightenment project and racism as a category, an intellectual category. But slavery is a different matter. The matter of African slavery is only part of a huge picture, so that the English enslaved Welsh people up to the 12th century. Christian Vikings even enslaved other Christians. Generally, the convenient thing is to enslave people who are very different from you. So Africans like that, people in South America, though actually the Spanish monarchy discouraged Indian slavery, Indio slavery. So it's much more complex than that very late phenomenon of the creation of racism. And you're right that that's an 18th and 19th century construction. But treating other people badly because they're different is a much older human instinct.
Ladies and gentlemen, another big round of applause, please. He'll be... Professor MacCulloch will be signing books in the book tent afterwards.
Thank you so much. Our author would be moving to the book signing area towards the left of Darbar Hall. This session was presented by the British Academy. Our next session at 2:30, A Tale of Two Cities from